Hey everyone, welcome back. Or if you're just joining us, welcome to KSSP Podcast. I'm Spencer.
And I'm Katie. Today we are going to be talking about the history and roots of the drug war. And we're going to start with this video about the U.S. Prohibition era from 1920 to 1933. And who's the video by?
It is, Simple History?
Simple History, yes.
So,
U.S. Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. The growing temperance movement in the 19th century and the Anti-Saloon League had argued that drinking alcohol was damaging American society by destroying families and creating corruption. During the First World War, as America entered the conflict in 1917, Woodrow Wilson put a temporary end to the manufacture of alcohol to save grain for the war effort. Religious and moral reasons also fueled the desire to restrict alcohol. The anti-drinking movements took advantage of this to encourage the government to make prohibition a permanent law, and in January 1919, the amendment was ratified as part of the Constitution. Prohibition began in the United States in January 1920, after the 18th Amendment became effective, making the manufacture and sale of alcohol now illegal. Even though arrests for drunkenness initially declined, the law was very difficult to enforce as public demand surged for illegal alcohol. On top of this, there weren't enough prohibition agents to enforce it. Bootleggers found inventive ways of manufacturing and selling liquor. They created homemade moonshine or bathtub gin and smuggled it into cities and bars. Some bars became speakeasies. In order to sell illegal alcohol, they were secret. Because of the shared problem of prohibition, all kinds of people from different sections of society gathered in them. One such group that owned many of the speakeasies and profited from the prohibition were organized crime groups. Al Capone and Bugs Moran battled for control over the bootlegging and speakeasy trade, resulting in gang violence and a shocking crime wave across America.
This just all sounds so familiar, you know?
how so?
Like, there's just a lot of comparisons to be made between this Prohibition era and the drug war. Like you see there's not speakeasies for drugs, but the same problems there are trap houses. But yeah, the same problems arise. There's not enough people to enforce the law. There's never going to be enough people to enforce those laws because criminals are always trying to stay 3 steps ahead of the police. And people still get caught, obviously, but whenever, one dealer gets caught, 3 more dealers are going to pop up. And people are fighting over turf. There's violence, gang violence, cartel violence, over turf, over debt, things like that. You just see the same parallels with the Prohibition era. And,
I guess, yeah. That makes
and when
sense.
you examine the Prohibition era, you can see how it applies to the drug war and why Prohibition in general just doesn't work.
I would agree with that. And I guess I didn't realize, I think in the beginning, they mentioned that religious institutions wanted the prohibition. Why? I guess, do you know why? Why religions were against alcohol? I feel like...
it's part of the religious texts that, you don't...
all religious texts?
Not all religious texts, but there's certain churches that interpret the Bible as saying, there's not as many these days, but, there's still some, I'm sure, but they interpret the Bible saying, intoxicating your body is basically ruining your temple or whatever.
I assumed it was a morality.
It isn't, yeah, it was definitely a morality thing.
But
I think he said that too.
Oh, I guess I missed that part. But I just never knew that, but
yeah,
it makes sense. When you explain it, I guess.
And also just the morality of it, pushing towards prohibition. People saying using alcohol was immoral. Well, what do people say nowadays? A lot of people say using drugs is a moral failure.
Yeah.
It's just history repeating itself.
Yeah, I'd say so.
In Between 1927 and 1930, there were hundreds of gang murders, with the most famous being the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago in 1929. Al Capone's men, some dressed up as policemen, killed several members of Moran's gang with machine guns while lined up against a wall.
Damn.
The murders were never officially linked to Capone. Eventually, Capone was brought down by a Prohibition agent named Elliot Ness for violating Prohibition law and tax evasion. In the same year, the Wickersham Commission had reported how Prohibition had been failing. Many Americans never wanted the law, and Prohibition agents were too few in number and easy to bribe. As well as this, it was clear that crime had risen rather than decreased before alcohol was illegal. In February 1933, Congress passed the 20...
Right there, the crime increased instead of decreased during the Prohibition era. And, I mean, we'll go over the evidence for this later, but I am going to say that as, you know, drugs tend to be decriminalized, crime seems to decrease, according to what we found. So, just pointing that out.
Yeah.
The First Amendment ending Prohibition. During Prohibition, millions of dollars worth of business went to bootleggers instead of the brewing industry. Subscribe for more history videos.
All right.
Get Simple
History coming out with a banger. All right, so let's go over a little more of the basic history here. One thing about the drug war is that the FBI's illegal counterintelligence program used drug war policies to try to discredit the civil rights movement and attack members of the Black Panther Party and other Black leaders. And another fun fact, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, said that drug laws allowed for permission to, quote, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. He also said, did we know we're lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And in 1971, the year Nixon launched the drug war, he was recorded laughing with California Governor Ronald Reagan, as they called Africans monkeys and cannibals. So that's nice. Real nice. Later, when he became president, Reagan greatly increased Nixon's drug war and mass incarceration. So this seems to be more of a scheme of attacking political opponents than it is anything about safety or morality. But those two things are used in order to convince the masses that the drug war is the right thing to do.
Yes. And then I just also have a little more history of how the war on drugs was implemented in America. Just some acts and different things here. So we'll just start with products such as heroin were sold over the counter in a form of cough syrup until 1912. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was the first U.S. law that restricted the distribution and use of certain drugs. On June 14, 1930, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was established in the United States. Due to the lack of restrictions in the Harrison Act of 1914, the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act was implemented in 1934. This act was publicly supported by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. While the Harrison Act was revenue producing and provided penalties for violations, it did not give states the authority of exercising police power regarding either seizure of drugs used in illicit trade or the punishment of those responsible. And then in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. And then the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970 was passed by Congress in October of 1970. This act categorized controlled substances based on their medicinal use and potential for addiction. A report on the growing heroin epidemic among U.S. servicemen in Vietnam was released in 1971 by 2 congressmen. And it turned out that 10 to 15% of the servicemen were addicted to heroin. And then that is also, I think, the year President Nixon declared drug abuse to be public enemy number 1. The DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, was created in 1973 to replace the BNDD, which was the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. When George H.W. Bush was vice president in 1982, he and his aides began pushing for the involvement of the CIA and U.S. military in drug interdiction efforts. And then, while I think a lot of blame gets placed on Nixon for the drug war, and I'm not saying he doesn't deserve any of the blame, it seems to appear that maybe Reagan has more blame for the negative consequence or actions, effects. So, the Nixon admin actually repealed the federal 2 to 10 year mandatory minimum sentences for possession of marijuana and started federal demand reduction programs and drug treatment programs. It was during the presidency of Ronald Reagan where we saw an expansion in the federal focus of preventing drug abuse and prosecuting offenders. During the first term of his presidency, Ronald Reagan signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. That act expanded penalties towards possession of cannabis, established the federal system of mandatory minimum sentences, and established procedures for civil asset forfeiture. The federal annual budget of the FBI's drug enforcement units went from $8 million to $95 million during the time period of 1980 to 1984 when Reagan was in office. Reagan appeared to be a strong proponent of criminalizing drug users during his presidency in the 1980s. According to historian Elizabeth Hinton, she wrote that he led Congress in criminalizing drug users, especially African-American drug users, by concentrating and stiffening penalties for the possession of the crystalline rock form of cocaine known as crack, rather than the crystallized methamphetamine that White House officials recognized was as much of a problem among low-income white Americans.
Yes. And then we have an article from the Drug Policy Alliance, A History of the Drug War. So we'll go over a little bit more of the history in detail. So the first anti-opium laws in the 1870s were directed at Chinese immigrants. The first anti-cocaine laws in the early 1900s were directed at black men in the South. And then the first anti-marijuana laws in the Midwest and Southwest in the 1910s and 20s were directed at Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. Today, Latino and especially Black communities are still subject to wildly disproportionate drug enforcement and sentencing practices. So, in June of 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He dramatically increased the size and presence of the federal drug control agencies and pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants, which, just going to say, no-knock warrants need to just be obliterated from any kind of police practice. They're just unsafe. They're unsafe for both the people who are being raided and also the cops. So yeah. There's that. Then a top Nixon aide, John Ehrlichman, later admitted, "You want to know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And that is a quote. Nixon temporarily placed marijuana in Schedule 1, the most restricted category of drugs, pending review by a commission he appointed later by Republican Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer. All right, and then in 1972, the next year, the commission unanimously recommended decriminalizing the possession and distribution of marijuana for personal use. Nixon ignored the report and rejected its recommendations. The presidency of Ronald Reagan marked the start of a long period of skyrocketing rates of incarceration, largely thanks to his unprecedented expansion of the drug war. The number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug law offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. So public concern about illicit drug use built throughout the 1980s, largely due to media portrayals of people addicted to the smokable form of cocaine dubbed crack. Soon after Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, his wife, Nancy Reagan, became a highly publicized anti-drug campaign, coining the slogan, "Just say no." Great slogan right there. Definitely going to make people stop using drugs.
Oh, yeah.
Especially because of the fact that there's some people who want to say yes. You know what I mean? Like, they're not going to just say no. But yeah. It's fine, I guess. I guess that's fine. So this set the stage for the zero tolerance policies implemented in the mid to late 1980s. Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates, who believed that casual drug users should be taken out and shot, and that is a quote, founded the DARE drug education program, which was quickly adopted nationwide despite the lack of evidence of its effectiveness. The increasingly harsh drug policies also blocked the expansion of syringe access programs and other harm reduction policies to reduce the rapid spread of HIV/AIDS, which, there were a lot of ways that he ignored the AIDS problem and the HIV problem, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Intentionally. And then, so George W. Bush arrived in the White House as the drug war was running out of steam. Yet he allocated more money than ever to it. His drug czar, John Walters, zealously focused on marijuana and launched a major campaign to promote student drug testing. While rates of illicit drug use remained constant, overdose fatalities rose rapidly. So the era of George W. Bush also witnessed the rapid escalation of militarization of the domestic drug law enforcement. By the end of Bush's term, there were about 40,000 paramilitary-style SWAT raids on Americans every year, mostly for nonviolent drug law offenses, often misdemeanors. While federal reform mostly stalled under Bush, state-level reforms finally began to slow the growth of the drug war. And then, in response to a worsening overdose epidemic, dozens of U.S. states passed laws to increase access to overdose antidote naloxone, aka Narcan, as well as 911 Good Samaritan laws to encourage people to seek medical help in the event of an overdose. Yet the assault on American citizens and others continues, with 700,000 people still arrested for marijuana offenses every year, and almost 500,000 people still behind bars for nothing more than a drug law violation. And that's out of about 2.3 million total incarcerated. So it's a pretty large chunk of people. And then President Obama, despite supporting several successful policy changes, such as reducing the crack powder sentencing disparity, which, if you don't know, basically, even though crack and cocaine are literally the same drug, when people who were caught with crack were given harsher sentencing than people caught with cocaine. And that was because crack was associated with the Black community, while cocaine is more associated with the white community. So I just wanted to explain that. And then Obama also worked to end the ban on federal funding for syringe access programs and ending federal interference with state medical marijuana laws. Did not shift the majority of drug policy funding to a health-based approach, though. The Trump administration threatened to take us backward toward a 1980s-style drug war. President Trump started building a wall to keep drugs out of the country and called for harsher sentences for drug law violations and the death penalty for people who sell drugs. Yes, that's true. There have been people who have been given the death penalty or at least brought to court for that, just because they sold someone something with fentanyl in it. And, sometimes you don't even know your drugs have fentanyl in them. So, yeah, that's nice. And he also resurrected disproven just say no messaging aimed at the youth. And 2020 brought the additional challenge of COVID-19 pandemic, a public health crisis that exposed the systemic issues with our society and revealed just how deeply the drug war permeates these systems. People who interact with these systems are unable to take the most basic steps to prevent the spread of COVID-19, including those in jail or prison, the homeless, people with substance use disorder because they're sharing needles and pipes and all that, those who rely on access to medication-assisted treatment or medical marijuana, and immigrants. During the crisis, it's harder for them to engage in social distancing and to access necessary medication-assisted treatment, such as methadone or buprenorphine, aka Suboxone, or medical marijuana, as well as other health and harm reduction resources. So now that we've gone over some of the history about the drug war, let's look into racism and inequality in our next episode.
And as always, you can leave a comment below if you have any ideas of future topics that you want us to go over in future episodes.
You can reach out to us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. We also occasionally do some Twitch live streams, so make sure to follow and watch out for those.
And don't forget to like this video and follow or subscribe to the rest of our social media accounts so that you don't miss out on future content over on those as well. Otherwise, we will see you all in the next video.